I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, home to the one and only story cycle system. Do you want people to actually give a crap about you and your purpose-driven company? Then our proven system will help you tell them a better friggin' story. And that's the secret sauce, folks. You gotta have a better, clear story. You can get started right now by downloading your 64-page DIY brand story strategy workbook at businessofstory.com. It's filled with examples, links to tutorial videos, and will help you clarify your story to grow your revenue and amplify your impact. And if you're really proud of how your brand story comes together, let me know. We might put you on our show to share your new narrative with the world. So download your story cycle guide right now as you listen to today's show.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
Imagine waking up early one morning with a wildfire whipping toward your home. You grab your spouse and a few keepsakes and you head for the door. There's no time to waste. The two of you barely escape the flames that devour your home and kill several of your neighbors. That's Sandra Younger's story, surviving the 2003 Cedar Fire in San Diego, California's largest wildfire ever. Her book about the disaster, The Fire Outside My Window, has been acclaimed as required reading for residents of wildfire country, adopted as a training text by top-level emergency professionals, and praised by reviewers as a couldn't-put-it-down page-turner. After the fire, Sandra discovered that personal resilience is both a natural strength and a skill set we can build like a muscle. Combining her own experience with leading academic research, she developed the Comeback Formula, a 5-step system of powerful, common-sense practices proven to transform disaster into opportunity and loss into legacy. Sandra is now the founder of Comeback Solutions International, sharing her resilience-boosting message as an international speaker, workshop leader, and media guest. In fact, she's appeared nationally on ABC, CBS, PBS, and was featured in the 2017 NBC Dateline special, Inferno. Today, Sandra and I will explore the intersection of resilience and storytelling. Resilience is the skill that transforms crisis into possibility and loss into legacy. But it only works if you're telling yourself and living into your most powerful, optimistic stories. On today's show, you'll learn the 5 steps of Sandra's Comeback Formula and how you can use them in your life. How to choose being the victor over rather than the victim of a loss or tragedy, and how our signature story is usually our comeback story. So let's get after it, and please welcome to the show, Sandra Younger. Sandra, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Park. I am delighted to be here.
Well, it's timely in somewhat of a sad way because of all the wildfires that are taking place. And that's how I first heard about you and your amazing book and what you and your husband experienced and how you escaped that. And we will get to that a little bit later in the show. But it is underscored to me because I grew up in the Pacific Northwest and was just recently up at our family's place in Lake Chelan on eastern Washington that looks very similar, believe it or not, to the Napa Valley region in a lot of respects. And, you know, everyone knows the horrific fires that have been rolling through there. Well, as a kid growing up in that region, up in the Pacific Northwest, we used to go up and hike in those mountains in the forest, and it was beautiful. And I can tell you, Sandra, now when we take our boat ride 55 miles up to the head of Lake Chelan, I bet you 60, if not 70% of that hillside and those forests have been burned away, almost all by natural causes, by the way, because it is up in the North Cascades, fairly remote. So when I saw your book, read your book, and learned more about you and what you went through in that 2003 wildfire, I thought, wow, I mean, what timing considering everything that we've been going through out here on the West Coast in wildfire land, seems like.
Right.
You come to this. So today we are going to really study and look at this intersection of resiliency and story. But your backstory, I guess, starts as a journalist. So you were steeped in story before you were thrown in escaped this killer wildfire in 2003, right?
Right. And even before I became a journalist, I grew up in the South. And I don't know if you've spent any time in the South, but we are all storytellers there. We sit out on the front porch with our sweet tea and our fried chicken, and we tell stories. And I was steeped in that environment. And then when I got to college, after a brief foray into sciences, which I still love, but it was organic chemistry, Park, that really made me think maybe I don't want to spend my life in science. Maybe I would rather be like Robert Frost and write about the natural world. And I started by being a reporter for my college paper, and I loved it. I loved having the opportunity to go out and ask a bunch of nosy questions, and meet a lot of interesting people and go to a lot of interesting events. And I was hooked. So that is how I became a journalism major and have now spent my entire adult life in one way or another telling stories as a journalist.
Where'd you go to school?
I started at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, the Wolfpack. And then I defected as my half my family are still NC State Wolfpack fans. So they see me as a defector to UNC Chapel Hill, the Tar Heels, because that's where the journalism school was.
Okay. So you were fleeing organic chemistry and went to journalism.
I was fleeing. Exactly. I had made it through regular chemistry. I'd made it through calculus. And of course, I loved biology and zoology, but my roommate was taking organic chemistry, and she was going through stack after stack of index cards, each with a separate reaction that she had to memorize. And I thought, who needs that? And do you know the real irony or coincidence maybe is that later, much, much later in my life, just a few years ago, I had an opportunity for the first time to interview a Nobel Prize winner.
Oh, cool.
And guess what his field was?
Organic chemistry.
Yes, organic chemistry. He had won the Nobel Prize for his work in hydrocarbons, and I was actually able to write a coherent piece about him and his work. And I thought, it's come full circle now. I really didn't need to study organic chemistry to be able to interview and spend some time with a Nobel Prize winner. So,
oh, that's perfect.
That's my organic chemistry story.
What did you do then when you graduated? Did you go into journalism and, before you started building a family and moving out to San Diego, or what did that look like?
What I did almost immediately was marry a Marine who hauled me off to Quantico, Virginia. And there were not a lot of job opportunities there. And then we went to 29 Palms, California. Also not really the mecca for journalistic opportunity, but I did manage to find a couple of jobs there in the desert. This is near Palm Springs. And I worked for a couple of little tiny papers there. One of them was called The Desert Trail, just community papers. And then we started a family. Eventually, we moved down to San Diego. So we were eventually back in a more prosperous community in terms of job opportunities.
So you're in San Diego, you've got your journalism background, and now do you have two kids, one kid? Or
I have two grown daughters, and I will soon, in about 6 months, have a grandchild. So
Congratulations. We share that as we talked
I
before
know,
we
isn't
fired
that-
up the show. Our daughter Corbin is going to have her first
Yeah.
or son, actually. Her first child is a boy here in a
Yes.
couple of weeks. So pretty exciting.
Congratulations. I know it's kind of exciting. But here's the thing. We see people. Have you seen these people who become grandparents and they lose their minds? So I know that's going to happen to us. We're going to become complete baby fans and probably.
It happens. And ironically enough, she lives over there where you live in San Diego.
He lives down the road.
That takes us to the next part of this story. Tell us about that night in 2003 when you woke up to this fire taking down your neighborhood. What happened?
One hot, windy night in October 2003, my husband and I woke up in the middle of the night in the middle of what is now known as the biggest wildfire in California's modern history, the Cedar Fire. So what happened was we saw fire outside our window, fire on the other side of the canyon, on the side of the mountain from where we lived, in a beautiful canyon with a view all the way to Mexico. And there was fire all across the mountain on the other side from us. And then we could see this glow deep in the canyon below us, which told us, Park, that the fire was also on our side, and we knew it was just leaping upslope toward us. So,
and you didn't see it before you went to bed. You didn't know it was there. So you woke up to this?
Right. We woke up to this. We knew that it was windy. We knew there were ashes in the wind. We had called around and tried to find somebody who knew something. But at that point, this fire was way out of control, and it was doing things and moving faster than people expected. And people were not able to get out in front of it to warn everyone. So we were told at the time, oh, it's a long way away and burning in the other direction. And we thought, all right, well, we'll just go back to bed then. And a couple hours later, we woke up to the sight of fire. So we knew we should have been out of there already. We grabbed our dogs. We had these two big, shaggy Newfoundland dogs. We had this little brainless cockatiel named Chelsea. We shoved her into a little traveling cage. We grabbed a few family photos off the dressers, off the walls. We threw them in a plastic laundry basket. We threw in some of my husband's negatives because he's a fine art photographer. And we jumped in the closest car, which happened to be my little Acura coupe. It couldn't have been Bob's giant Suburban because we couldn't find the keys to that. So I'm driving, and we back out into this swirl of red embers, tornadoes of embers and ashes in this crazy wind. And we see this white hot glow silhouetting our house. And we know the fire is right there.
And by the way, you do have your daughters with you too, right?
No, at this point,
No?
our
Where were they?
daughters had already left home.
Oh, okay.
They were in college at the time.
Gotcha.
So-
Okay. I was thinking, where are the kids? Where are the kids? All
Of
right.
course, parents think that. I should have mentioned. But yes, they
All right.
were off on their own. Thankfully, we didn't have to worry about getting the kids, just the furry and feathery kids. And so we had these two giant dogs stuffed in the back of my little tiny coupe, and we take off, and there's only one way out. So we're headed down this little narrow sliver of asphalt that is literally cut into the side of this mountain. And just as we hit the most treacherous part of it, we run into a bank of smoke. And it was just impenetrable, Park. It was like looking out of an airplane window into a cloud. And I started to scream, I can't see the road. And my husband said, you're just going to have to remember where it is. And I said, but I can't see anything. And he said, well, just don't wreck the car. Yes, that is the comic relief of this story. Yeah.
And are you being followed by your neighbors at this point too?
No,
or is it
we
just
didn't
you on
know
the
where
road?
anybody was. We didn't have time, and the fire was right on top of us. It was every person for.
Yeah. Could you feel the heat from the fire?
We couldn't feel the heat, but
You could see the smoke. It was glowing around you,
We
and you
were
just knew you had to get the heck out of
stuck in the smoke. And the one who could feel the heat was a bobcat who had been living pretty close to our home for a long time. I'd seen him once before on the road on my way out to work in the morning. And just at that moment when we are teetering on the side of this mountain, lost in the smoke, a bobcat jumps out of the brush, running right ahead of the fire, and lands right in front of my headlights. And I saw him for just an instant, and then it dashed off into the smoke. And something in me knew that the cat was on the road I couldn't see, and something in me knew to follow it. So I followed this bobcat. And when I got to the point where the bobcat had disappeared into the smoke, suddenly I could see something. I could see these two red fields, just smears of red to the right and the left ahead of me, and this dark place in the middle. And I knew two things. I knew that everything ahead of us was on fire. And I knew that the dark place was the road. So I steered for the dark place, and man, there is a sermon in there somewhere, right?
Wow.
When you steer for the darkness, and the darkness is your salvation. And it took us both to find our way through these two lines of fire, just right, left, straight, don't wreck it, just keep going. And by the time we got to the main road out of our neighborhood, we were both, Bob and I both, just praying out loud, like, help us find our way out of this fire. And I felt my tires crunching on gravel. And then the next thing I knew, I was seeing the lines of the pavement of the main road. And I just put my car on top of those lines and followed them, still in the smoke, still with fire on both sides of us, for about a half a mile more, until we finally punched out of it through this big curtain of flame. And all of a sudden, the fire was behind us. And that is how my husband and I and our two big shaggy Newfoundland dogs and our tiny brainless cockatiel Chelsea made it out of the biggest wildfire in California's history.
And what did it feel like when you punched through?
It was surreal, actually. The feeling was, oh, well, that was easy. What was that? And of course, it wasn't easy at all. It was the same thing that 12 of our neighbors were doing at the same time, 12 of our neighbors who didn't make it out. And yet there was something about just that clear division between the chaos and this surreal nightmare and normalcy that just made it all seem like a dream.
And the Cedar Fire ultimately claimed 15 lives, but 12 of those were your neighbors.
12 of those were people who lived within a mile or two of us, which out in the backcountry where we lived, that's pretty close neighbor distance.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's just amazing. So when your daughters heard about this fire going on, they must have called and said, Mom, Dad, how are you doing? And then you probably shared with them the harrowing experience you had.
Well, we called them first because we knew it was going to be on the news. So as soon as we found our way down the canyon, we got to finally some place where we could stop and rest. We started calling them, and it's by now like 6 a.m. And we had to leave messages. I remember this, and you'll appreciate this as a parent, even though they were in their 20s at the time. You know, I had to leave this message that said, honey, I just want you to know we're okay, but our house is probably gone. There's this huge fire in San Diego, and we love you. We'll talk to you later. That was the message we had to leave. Mm-hmm.
And that would be a rather sobering message to receive as a child.
Oh, of course. Even as a grown child. Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then it led to the book, The Fire Outside My Window. A survivor tells the true story of California's epic Cedar Fire.
Right.
When did the book come about? And what was it about that experience that really propelled you to write it?
I had always wanted to write a book because I'd been a journalist all my life. But despite a couple of false starts, I'd never come across a story that was compelling enough to keep me going on this book. There just wasn't a big enough why behind it. And when I came out of this fire, I realized that I was a storyteller who had come out of the worst part of the worst fire that people could remember for a long, long time, and that it was my duty to tell the story. So people ask me, why did you write the book? And my answer to that is because I couldn't not write the book. This was the story park that grabbed me by the throat and wouldn't let me go until I had told it. And if you had told me then that the book would not come out until the 10-year anniversary of the fire, I would have said, oh, forget it then. I'll go find 1,000 other things to do in that time. But I realized as a journalist, as a professional storyteller, that I was never going to have a bigger, better story in terms of just pure drama fall into my lap. I mean, and I would hope that I wouldn't, because I might not survive a bigger story. And I had to tell it, that if I did not tell that story, I could just quit calling myself a storyteller.
So it sounds like more than just a book came out of this experience, because you came up with the comeback formula, a resilience system, 5 powerful common sense practices proven to transform crisis into possibility. I'm reading from your workbook.
Right.
So this whole fire is much more than a book. You saw a lot of things go down. I suppose just escaping the fire was just the beginning of this entire journey.
It's true. And you mentioned earlier our fellow Californians in the wine country and up near Ukiah, north of there, people in Washington and Oregon, in your neck of the woods, people up in British Columbia, people in Montana, not to mention all of the hurricane survivors. All of them are now beginning this next phase, this next chapter, if you will, of their lives, which I call the comeback journey. And as I was writing my book, I interviewed dozens and dozens of people, firefighters, other fire survivors, subject matter experts, family members of the ones we lost, the true victims of the fire. And I saw a lot of different responses to this journey of coming back from disaster and being literally wiped out in terms of material goods. And I saw that most people came at it with this resilient attitude, this determination to reboot and rebuild and come back strong. There's nothing like losing all of your worldly possessions, but being able to save your family that tells you what's truly important. We had an opportunity in the midst of all of that chaos and catastrophe to really be reminded of what's truly important. And most of us looked at that and said, yes, we're going to miss the things we can't replace, but most of what we lost is stuff. And we've got what's truly important, and we're moving on and we're coming back. And there was a minority opinion of people who seemed to relate, to embrace the label that the media and everybody lays on you after an event like that, which is victim. Suddenly, by the next day, we're homeless, we're being called fire victims. And I really bristled at that. I rejected that label. I thought our 12 neighbors who didn't make it out are the victims. Or as one of my neighbors said, we buried the victims and the rest of us are survivors. But there was this small group of people who embraced the victim mentality, the victim identity. And I started to wonder what made the difference between these two, especially because it didn't seem to matter how much or how little they'd lost in the fire. Some of the people who had lost the least were the most bitter. And I talked with 2 separate families who had each lost 3 loved ones in the fire, and they weren't bitter. They were grief-stricken, but they were determined not to let their lives be destroyed by this, because their loved ones would want them to go on and be happy. So it was interesting that there was this dichotomy, and it told me that there was a choice involved here. There was a choice, not necessarily about what happened to us, but about our response to it. And I like to call that choice choosing our story.
Mm-hmm. And what was the difference you saw in those that choose to be a victim or chose to be a victim or chose to be the victor of the situation?
I've heard this saying that that pain is inevitable and suffering is optional. I don't know if that's always true, but it seemed to me that the people who were the most bitter, especially those who had lost the least, for example, an office or a garage, not even the home. And it seemed that they were miserable people. That seemed to be a hallmark between them. And I met some of these people later, years later after the fire, because remember, I was still researching it for years later, and they were still miserable people. Now, maybe they had been unhappy before, but that was the main difference I saw, is that these people seem to be choosing their own suffering.
Yeah. And when you say miserable people, it's not that you found them to be miserable, but they just had a lot of misery. They chose to live in misery versus being bad people.
So I started to wonder if there's a choice in our outlook about this. What else may be within our control after experiencing a catastrophe of some sort? And I wondered if maybe there were some common steps in coming back from disaster or crisis that were the same, even though the inciting incident was different. And I started looking into this, and I found out that I was late to this party because philosophers have been talking about this for millennia, and positive psychologists have done a whole lot of research into this. There's an entire body of work on resilience. That's what it's called, personal resilience. And in fact, there's a subset of the resilience literature on post-traumatic growth. And I thought, well, that's fascinating. Post-traumatic growth, this idea that some people can use a crisis as a springboard, as fuel to building better lives. And you look around and you see a lot of the people we most admire as world changers have experienced tremendous suffering. You look at the Dalai Lama, you look at Malala, you look at Nelson Mandela, and these are people that have leveraged their personal loss into a legacy for the world. So I found that all of this has been studied, and there are certain steps that we can do ourselves that boost our resilience. That resilience is not just something we're born with as an innate trait, but it's also a skill set we can build like a muscle. And of course, all of this research out there just offers hundreds of potential ideas. And being a journalist, I'm also a synthesizer, and I synthesized it down into 5 buckets that pretty much contain all of the recommendations. And those 5.
Oh, hold it. Wait for it, because I just want to make an observation.
Yes.
I think it's fascinating when you talked about, you looked at this and the body of work around resiliency, you're right, has been around for a long time, yet you were attracted to this post-traumatic growth concept.
Yeah.
Well, you were probably attracted to it because you were living it. If you think about it, you went through this traumatic incident, and your post-traumatic growth was not to wallow in the misery, but to say, let me study this. Mm-hmm. Let me understand how people actually react to it, why they react the way they react, and then how could I teach everyone from first responders to people that have experienced this kind of loss, to nonprofits that work in this area, to brand storytellers that are out, for purpose-driven brands, to help them understand and appreciate it. And you've boiled it down to these 5 steps, which I think is also interesting because essentially, Sandra, you know what you've done?
What's that?
You are the organic chemist for resilience. You simply have pulled apart the active properties of resilience from your own experience, and you've come up then with this molecule of 5 really important parts that
Wow.
make up the stories around resilience.
You're good, Art. You are
Just occurred to me when you were telling me that.
Wow. See, that is a story strategist right there who can connect these dots that the storyteller does not see for herself. That's brilliant. I love that. And it's true.
And I got to give hats off to Tamsin Webster because, as I mentioned too at the beginning of the show, I've been fortunate enough to be invited to speak at TEDx Gilbert here in Arizona this coming March. Yeah. So I'm really pumped. And Tamsin Webster, who was on our show 2 years ago, and I'll have to look up the show number and give that to you. She is marvelous at helping people put together their TED Talks, their presentations, and their stories. And she and I were literally just talking about this in my coaching call with her when we're talking about finding the moments in our lives that define us. That so often we are so focused on the big, grand, epic story of which you lived through, and most of us are, thank God, are not going to live through that kind of epic tragedy in our lives. But it's the moments that define us. So when you talked about first having an interest in studying organic chemistry, it just was hanging in my head. Well, that has to play out to this somehow. And what it is you simply have used that to decipher what resilience really means in these 5 areas. So let's jump in. What are those 5 areas?
Let's jump in organically. Well, the first principle of what I have labeled the comeback formula is the word come, as in come to a place of gratitude. And there is so much scientific research out there to support what our moms always tried to tell us, which was say thank you. What do you say? Say thank you. Write a thank you note, or grandma won't give you a present next birthday, right? I was that kind of mom too. But gratitude is pretty much the antidote to any negative emotion. And we know that if you can find one tiny thing, even if it's just a tiny thing to be grateful for, even in the midst of catastrophe, it keeps us from getting stuck in what I think of as this quicksand of bitterness and anger and blame. We do have to go through the anger. That is part of the cycle of grief, as we know. And we do have to grieve our losses after any sort of a disaster, whether it's a fire or a hurricane or a job loss or even a fender bender that totals our car. We have to go through those stages, but we don't have to get stuck there like so many of those negative people I met were. So gratitude is the balloon that begins to lift us out of that quicksand.
And why do you think that works? You hear that a lot, and I will be one of the first to go for the gratitude thing and make a bunch of thank yous. And it, for some reason, doesn't always work for me. And I think, man, it's sort of Pollyanna. But then other times when I do it, it does totally change my mindset. Why do you think that works?
I think it works because we are naturally, perhaps even genetically predisposed to focus on the negative and to think either in arrears, to regret or mull over what's happened in the past, or to worry about what's happened in the future rather than in living the moment right now. And I think what gratitude does is it shifts our focus from the negative to the positive. And if we're still alive, that's a positive place to start. It was not difficult for Bob and me to feel grateful, even though we had lost our house and we'd lost everything we owned except what was in that laundry basket we pulled out of there, what was in our offices, what was at the dry cleaners. That was it. It was not hard for us to feel grateful, however, because we were alive and because we had been able to bring our animals out with us. So I think that is the reason it works, is because it does recalibrate our mindset from the negative to the positive.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right about us being pre-programmed for that negativity bias. And there's a terrific book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it because it sort of speaks to what you're speaking to here. It's called Rapt, Attention and the Focused Life by Winifred Gallagher. I read it several years ago and I go back to it quite a bit. And it just talks about how we do draw our rapt attention about the negativity in our life. But if we can make that shift, as you talk about in gratitude, it can make a complete difference about maybe turning that quicksand of misery into concrete to rise above it, and we can get out of there.
Right.
So,
And,
a really good book.
Yeah, I'm glad to know about that book. I think that it's the one thing that is easy to implement into our lives too. I try to do all of these Zen things. I try to meditate and write in my journal and get some exercise in a given day. But if I don't get any of that done, which happens more often than I'd like to admit, what I do every morning is the first thought in my mind is to be grateful for this day. This is a day that I've been given and I want to make the most of it. Thank you for this day. And that is an easy habit to form, and it can be so powerful. So that's the first step of the comeback formula.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Number two.
What's two. So we're starting down the acronym now of BACK for come back. So the B stands for a couple of things. The first is to be patient. To be patient with the pain, with the process. When life turns into a huge bloody mess, we can't fix it right away. These people who are facing rebuilding their homes, it's going to take them at least 2 years. And that's on the fast side. We have to be patient with all of that. And yet, the next B is to believe that it's possible to come back, because resilience is in our DNA. We are part of a resilient universe, and we live in a world where winter always turns into spring. This is who we are. We are a comeback people. So to be patient with the process and yet believe that it is possible to come back is the second step.
We are comeback people.
Mm-hmm.
I like that line.
Mm-hmm.
That'd make a great t-shirt. We are comeback people.
Yeah.
But you're right. Be patient, go through it. You get your nose bloodied by the universe. The first thing you want to do is fight back and scream and holler and yell and say, gosh, why can't I just get this over with?
Yeah.
And yet it seems like the more we struggle like that quicksand you talked about,
Mm-hmm.
the faster we sink into it.
That's what quicksand
where you have to
does,
take
right?
that deep, yeah, right. And you have to take that deep breath and say, all right, let's wade through this a little bit and see if we can find a vine and pull ourselves out and believe that we can do that.
Right.
Come back, people.
Right.
What's next then?
So A stands for accept help and ask for it when you need it. And this is the toughest one, even though this is the step that speaks to faith in a higher power. This is the step that speaks to connection and community, incredibly important to resilience and coming back. And yet this is the hardest step of all, because we don't want to be anybody's charity case. I didn't necessarily want people sending me their hand-me-down clothes or giving me checks. It just made me feel awkward and embarrassed. And finally, a friend of mine who also happened to be a psychologist pulled me aside and she said, Sandra, you are resisting the help that people are offering you. And your job right now is to be a grateful recipient. And it's hard for those of us who think of ourselves as helpers and givers to find ourselves on the other end of that equation. And yet she reminded me that if I wanted to still be a giver, to give other people the opportunity to help me. It's like that line from Jerry Maguire, help me, help you.
Right. And so why do you think that is? I mean, that is such a interesting study of the human consciousness that, very capable individual, always about helping other people. But then when it comes down to you actually needing help, pushing it away. Is it just an ego thing?
It was embarrassing. And I can't really explain that, but I will tell you a little story about how it really backfired on me. People were giving us checks and, as I said, in casseroles on the front porch, and people we didn't even know were doing all these amazing things for us. And I was, at the time, I'd been taking Japanese lessons, and That's another story as to why I got into that. But my Japanese teacher gave me a check for $100. And I knew that she was living on a teacher's salary and didn't necessarily have a lot of disposable income, or at least that was my impression of her, probably not a valid judgment. And I said, thank you so much. And then about a month later, she gave me another check for $100. And I just felt like I was taking money I felt like she might need that more than I did. I did not acknowledge her desire to help me. I did not give her the opportunity to experience that. I did not give her the respect of being able to do that. And so I gave that check back to her. And my husband said, "What are you doing? You've been studying Japanese language and culture, and you know that the Japanese are such a giving people. It's part of their culture to give thank you gifts." And I will tell you that 10 years later, when my book came out, my Japanese teacher took me out to lunch and she had baked me a cake, which I took very gratefully, let me tell you. And she said, "You gave that check back to me." So that was before I learned, to be a grateful recipient, to be a giver by giving others the opportunity to help, because we are a social species. We depend on each other like a hive of bees or a pack of wolves or a flock of birds. We're not isolated beings. And yet when something like that hits, for some reason we say, "Oh no, we're good." Mm-hmm. Now, the other part of this is asking for help when we need it. And a lot of times I talk with emergency professionals, including first responders, and I really focus on this with them part because it is hard, as hard as it is for any of us to accept help. I guess it's part of it is we don't want to appear weak. We don't want to be the needy ones. We want to feel like we've got it. So imagine if it's this hard for us as everyday people, how hard it is to call 911, metaphorically speaking, when you are 911. And yet our emergency professionals are exposed to so much trauma on a day-to-day basis, and they carry so much stress with them, so much that they've seen that they cannot unsee. And it comes out in other ways, in all of these negative behaviors and substance abuse and divorce and even suicide. Suicide rates among our emergency responders are shockingly high. It's because it hasn't even been okay for them to admit for so long that their work is traumatic and that does take a toll, much less to ask for help. So I make a point of this. And what I do to help our emergency responders understand that it's not only okay to ask for help, but it's necessary to their work is I tell them the hero's journey.
And how does that play into it?
Because the public sees our responders as heroes. They are familiar with that. They may not feel that way, but they know that that's out there in the culture. These are our heroes. And rightly so. These are the people who run toward danger when everyone else is running the other way. And here's what I tell them. I say, we know something about heroes. We know they all travel the same path. They're all on the same journey. And we know that because this famous mythologist, our friend, right, Joseph Campbell, studied all of the great archetypal stories from every age throughout history, from every culture, and decided they were all the same story and they ran through the same steps. And one of those inescapable steps of being a hero is accepting help, usually from a mentor or guide. And I show them slides. Here is how this story plays out in our culture. You already know this story. I show them a picture of Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan. When Obi-Wan is handing Luke the lightsaber. And I say often the cool thing about mentors or guides is they give us a handy tool. some sort of magical tool that we can use. And I show a picture of Harry Potter and Dumbledore. And of course, Harry has his wand. And I show a picture of Dorothy and Glinda, the Good Witch. And then I show finally a picture of Luke and Yoda, because Yoda reminds us that sometimes help comes in very unexpected ways from unexpected sources. And so I say to them, it's not wimpy, it's not weak to ask for help, to be tough enough to ask for help when we need it. It's wise, and it's essential to the hero's journey. You cannot be a successful hero otherwise.
And you and I share a video that we both love, a TED Ed video created by Matthew Winkler about and it's called What Makes a Hero. It's a 3-minute animated, wonderful. And by the way, it's one of the most watched TED Ed videos of all. And I think, anyways, it's because it has, of course, covering the universal structure of the story, but I think it becomes familiar when people that aren't even aware of Joseph Campbell or the hero's journey see it. They have an aha moment. They go, oh, yes. I see that in the films I watch, the TV shows I watch. I actually see it in my own life. It's a really, really wonderful, quick depiction of the hero's journey.
It is. And I show that sometimes when I have a little bit more time in my workshops. And it does make the point very quickly and very powerfully.
And interesting to that point, Matthew Winkler, the gentleman that created this, I had him on Business of Story on show number 24, and he talked about the reason he made that video, and that is because he was an English teacher back in New Jersey, 8th or 9th grade, middle school basically.
Wow.
And he said he was getting so upset, like anybody would be, of the teenage suicides that were going on, that he started studying the hero's journey and started bringing it to these kids and saying, look don't be depressed. Don't wallow in this misery. You are just going through the natural stages of life. And he did it and created this video in hopes to not only educate them about the story structure, but to curb the teen suicides that he had seen happening in his own school district.
Isn't that
really an amazing gentleman?
That's fascinating. And I'm doing the same thing, trying to add my voice to this growing awareness that our responders need to feel free within their organizations to be tough enough to ask for help when they need it. That's great.
Absolutely.
Similar.
And then that leads to your fourth step then about choosing your story.
Yes, choosing our story. That's what we've already talked about. And my mentor here was Viktor Frankl, who you probably know, brilliant Austrian psychiatrist and also a Holocaust survivor. And he was at the worst of the camps. He was at Dachau, he was at Auschwitz, and he came out of that crucible of suffering and wrote this amazing book called Man's Search for Meaning. And the quote that spoke to me was when he said, the last of the human freedoms is the freedom to choose one's own attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So I figured, even though I couldn't compare my fire experience in any way with Viktor Frankl's deep suffering, that I could defer to his wisdom on it. If it worked in that situation, it would work for any situation. So that is the fourth step, is to choose your story. You can choose to be a victim if you want to be. You can choose to be the victim of the story, or you can choose to be the hero going through the inevitable ups and downs and slings and arrows of the hero's journey on your way to becoming not a victim, but a victor.
Well, by the way, you had mentioned at the top of the show about the news reports, and they always characterize folks that have gone through something like this, and in your case, a fire victim. And I think, again, they're doing it simply for narrative structure, because all good stories have to have an evil villain. In this case, the evil villain is the destructive, heartless fire that destroyed homes and lives, and therefore you have to be a victim to make that story play out. It's not nearly as interesting in the time and the immediacy of the event to have that person being an immediate victor. You got to be a victim first. So people hear that, they believe that's the frame now, that they've got to live through this story, and they become the victim and never really, I guess, transfer over or transition up into being the victor over it.
Yeah. And you see, the wonderful thing about this story structure, that the hero's journey lays out for us is that this wonderful narrative arc or dramatic arc, story arc, whatever we call it, is you can flip that terrible experience where you feel like you're down in the pit, stuck in the quicksand. If you flip that into the mirror image, it becomes the summit of the narrative arc, the tipping point, the crisis from which the everyday person becomes a hero. So the victim can become the victor.
Yeah. It's so interesting because it is absolutely embedded in, woven through our lives, this framework of the hero's journey.
Isn't it? Yes.
Yeah. And when you really get familiar with it and know you're exactly right. You can flip it on its head and come out of the other side a much stronger, better person. Ultimately, that's what the hero's journey is you get tested.
Right.
You get put through crucibles. In your case, it was one evening crucible. In Viktor Frankl's case, it was over the course of several years, I believe. But you come out of the other end and it's your choice. And so what is step 5 in this?
All right. The last step is to keep moving forward. What this step speaks to is the necessity of gradually releasing our hold on the past, detaching from this past that can never come back as much as we wish that it would, because that frees us to embrace the possibilities of a new future that would not have been possible otherwise. Part of this moving forward piece, part of this detaching is forgiveness, to forgive others and ourselves for whatever happened so that we can move forward unencumbered and discover what's on the other side of this bridge. You know, I thought about this in my own experience as I came to a bridge in my life, and on the other side, I could see this wonderful, enticing land that I just wanted to go explore. But when I started across the bridge to go explore it, the ogre, you know, there's an ogre in every story. The ogre pops out, the troll under the bridge, and says, well, you got to pay the toll. Well, what is the toll? Everything you own. No one would pay everything they owned to cross a bridge and explore this unexplored land, no matter how interesting or fascinating it looked. But if the toll has already been paid, why not go across and see what's on the other side? And that's the decision that I made coming out of my own crisis.
Well, and as we talked earlier about you expressing your own post-traumatic growth through this process, you also were on the hero's journey yourself. Your inciting incident, your normal world was turned upside down the moment you woke up early that one morning in October to see the flames coming up the mountainside, having to literally drive through the crucible, enter into this new extraordinary world. In this case, having lost virtually everything except your lives, the most important thing of all. And yes, you could have chosen to be bitter and a victim, but you said, how can I put this to work for me? Or even more importantly, how can I put this to work in service to others, to help them understand what they go through?
Right.
Something like that.
Yes, it definitely was a surreal other world for a while there.
Well, why did it take you 10 years to do the book? Was it just all a matter of the research and the interviews and coming to grips with what went down?
Yes, all of that. And many writers' nemesis of being a master procrastinator came into play. I was also doing a couple of other things at the time. I was still working for a while. I was rebuilding my house. I built a school in Africa during this time. Yeah, I found all sorts of ways not to write. But I think I have to look at it as divine timing in the end. If I had popped the book out right away, it would not have been the same book that it is. It would have been more of a repertorial accounting of an incident. It is unique among fire books, and there is a genre of fire books out there because it tells the story from the civilian side. And most every other book that I've seen out there is only from the firefighter side. So it became a deeper book. It became a book that could be not just a story about a fire, but a receptacle of all the wisdom that those of us who lived through that time acquired. This idea that you don't have to be a victim. you can be a survivor and then a thriver, and eventually you can leverage your loss into a legacy for others. That didn't happen overnight. And so it turned out to be a good thing that it took the book a long time to gestate, even though it didn't feel like it at the time.
Everything in its due time. Now,
right.
You have not only this book, but you have a workbook that listeners can download and actually put the comeback formula to work for them.
I have a copy of the comeback formula they can download, and also what I call the 5-minute resilience workout. And it's just a simple list of these powerful common sense practices that we can do to boost our resilience. So they can download that at comebackformula.com, comebackformula.com. So it's a list of these 5 steps we've talked about. Is the 5-minute resilience workout. And then once they get to the download page, they will be on my website, and there are links there to the full Comeback Formula workbook and also the Fire Outside My Window, the full book about the Cedar Fire, if they're interested in purchasing that.
And who would be best to use this workbook? Who's it really written for?
I wrote it primarily for other disaster survivors, and I'm in the process right now of reprinting so we can ship more to Northern California fire zones. But really, the comeback formula is that molecule of all the different elements of resilience. So it has universal application, and I try to use it myself every day. You don't have to be in the middle of a crisis to benefit from these reminders. Am I being grateful? Am I looking for the positive today? Am I accepting the help that's available to me? Or am I being stubborn and saying, no, I've got this? Am I being tough enough to ask for it? Am I choosing my attitude? And am I detaching from past things that I can't have now, forgiving and moving ahead and looking for the new? All of that is universal to any day-to-day experience.
Yeah, so it's going to kind of fireproof you, I guess, against crisis.
That's one way to look at it. We can build our resilience like a muscle in advance of a catastrophe, so that when that hits, we already have these practices in place. That's why it's a system. It's a system of practices that we can implement, and it causes us to become more resilient, even ahead of schedule.
Yeah. And all of this came out of then simply your interviews of people that have gone through this, first responders, reading about resiliency in your study. And that's how you arrived at these 5 very common sense practices.
Asking a lot of questions, talking to a lot of people, reading a lot of the books that have come out of this area. You're right.
Yeah. Well, Sandra, thank you so much. It really, really fascinating. The book is fantastic. The Fire Outside My Window, a survivor tells the true story, the California's epic Cedar Fire. And then, of course, the Comeback Formula workbook at comebackformula.com. Thank you for sending me that PDF. I got a chance to flip through it, and I thought it was so cool. But really appreciate your time for being here on Business of Story today, Sandra.
Park, it has been a joy to chat with another storyteller. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I have not been through what you've been through, thank goodness, but I can see how I can put the comeback formula to work for me right after this show, because it seems like we're always dealing with some sort of crisis, large or small, fiction or nonfiction, but it's in how we go about it and what stories we tell ourselves that are going to get us through it stronger and not be the victim of it.
That's right. We get to choose our stories.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for listening to this edition of Business of Story. So great to have you here. And if you are a leader of a purpose-driven brand, or you are an individual trying to build that purpose-driven influence brand in the world, stay with us here at Business of Story, because we bring you people like Sandra every single week to help you really understand how to find your stories, how to craft your stories, how to share them with the world, and maybe most importantly, how to live into them. Because as you've heard me say many times, the most powerful story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. And if I can be of service to you, visit me at businessofstory.com. Download your workbook to start working on your story today. And until next Sunday, when we bring you another amazing story artist, have a wonderful life.